Is Sabbath keeping mandatory for Christians? Well, we've got our special guest back on today who's going to be giving arguments for why Christians are required to keep the Sabbath, and I'm going to be giving answers to address each one of these arguments. So with that, okay, and before I even get started, I just want to point out the reality. You are a Sunday worshiper. That's all you are. You left the true remnant church to become a Sunday worshiper. So before we get going with your little wimpy Sabbath breaking arguments, don't forget that the Sabbath is mentioned as a command in Luke 23, where it says that they rested on the Sabbath according to the commandment. And also, don't forget about Jesus' Olivet Discourse, where Jesus specifically instructed to pray that your flight will not take place on the Sabbath. And we all know that Jesus was referring to the future events of the tribulation. So doesn't that prove that we need to keep the Sabbath today if we're going to be keeping it in the future? Also, do I need to jog your memory about Isaiah 66, where it says, "And it shall be from new moon to new moon, and from Sabbath to Sabbath, all mankind will come to bow down before me." This shows, once again, that since the Sabbath will be kept in heaven, and in the new earth, and the age to come, so if it's going to be observed for all of eternity, doesn't this also prove that it should be kept now? So if we're going to be keeping the Sabbath in heaven, shouldn't we be keeping it now? Well, you just covered a lot just now, and we're going to be going through all of your arguments. And for the record, former Adventists don't leave Adventism to become Sunday worshipers. And I realize this is a common accusation from Adventists. Instead, I worship the one true triune God, and I left Adventism for the simple fact that I became a born-again Christian. And the concept of being a born-again Christian is something that Adventism doesn't teach its members at all, which correlates with the fact that it's a false form of Christianity. But first, let's address this assertion that in Luke 23 that the Sabbath is given as a command. But before we start combing through this, let's get that bird's eye view and keep in mind that the four Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, give us the history of Jesus' life, death, burial, and resurrection, while the epistles, which come after the Gospels, tell us the meaning of Jesus' life, death, burial, and resurrection. Let's remember that prior to Jesus' death, not even the disciples believed that Jesus was going to be resurrected. Remember, prior to his death, they did not even understand the fact that he was going to be raised. And keep in mind that even after his resurrection, they struggled to grasp that he'd been raised until he appeared to them. And when Mary came and told them, Peter and John were like, huh? So the point is, we can see that the disciples did not yet understand the meaning and the after effects of Jesus' life, death, and burial and resurrection. So with all that in mind, when we come to the end of Luke where it says they were resting on the Sabbath according to the commandment, this does correspond with the fact that the disciples themselves did not yet even understand the meaning of Jesus' sacrificial life, death, and resurrection. But this is another reason why the Bible doesn't just end at Luke 23:56. Let's keep in mind that prior to about 65 AD, which was when the book of Hebrews was written, all Jews who converted into Christianity were still taking part in animal sacrifices, priestly ordinances. They still observed the priesthood. They were still observing the Mosaic system up until the book of Hebrews was written. And again, the book of Hebrews was written over 60 years after Jesus ascended. So in Luke 23, where it says the women were still observing the Sabbath, immediately after Christ's crucifixion, which was even prior to his resurrection, correlates with the reason why the epistle to the Hebrews was written. Adventists, this is why we have the epistles, and the Bible doesn't just end after the last gospel, after John. The epistles explain the meaning behind Jesus' sacrificial life, death, and his resurrection. Context, context, context. We can't just take a verse like Luke 23:56 and base a whole doctrine off of it, because as it says in Colossians 2, not to let anyone judge you or hold you to food laws, the feasts, the new moons, or a Sabbath day. And just look at how it lumps all these things together in this verse, because these are ritual laws, and as it says, they were just shadows or pictures of Christ. But now that we have Christ, who is the real substance, he fills those shadows with their true meaning. We don't need pictures or shadows anymore. That's what the epistles very clearly explain. Again, the epistles explain the meaning. That's why we have them. Well, Jesus said, pray that your flight won't come in the winter or on the Sabbath. And we all know that Jesus was talking about the future. Doesn't that prove that we should keep the Sabbath today? So we know that Matthew was written to the Jews, so let's keep that in mind. Jesus was referring to a specific time, to a specific people, for a specific reason. And I'm going to explain what I mean by this, and it's noteworthy that both in Mark and in Luke, which are the two other places which record the Olivet Discourse, the Sabbath is excluded. So the fact that the Sabbath is excluded in both Mark and Luke does correlate with the fact that Matthew was written to the Jews who would be able to relate to the Sabbath, whereas the Gentile believers, who both Mark and Luke were written to, would not be able to relate. That in mind, when we're looking at Matthew 24:20, Jesus was speaking to his disciples about the end times, the time of the tribulation. And we see he's specifically referring to the tribulation believers who will be alive at the end time. And Jesus is explaining that there will be a time when they will be required to flee from persecution. And Jesus is saying that they need to pray to God to make their traveling easier when it's time to flee. For example, in the same verse, he says, pray that it doesn't come in the winter. Obviously, inclement, bitter cold weather with ice and snow could make traveling, fleeing, running away from someone more difficult. In the same way, he says, pray that your flight doesn't come on the Sabbath either, since Jewish law permitted them to travel only about a mile on the Sabbath. So if they traveled beyond a mile, they would more likely be subject to persecution from other unbelieving Jews during the time of the tribulation. In other words, the unbelieving Jews who would likely see the Jewish believers traveling on the Sabbath would be much more inclined to persecute them, throw them in jail, physical persecution, etc., because they would see them traveling on the Sabbath. What Jesus is saying here by including both the winter and the Sabbath is for them to pray that their journey will be easier when it's time to flee from persecution. That their journey won't be impeded by anything when it's time to flee. And if you still think I'm wrong on this, again, context. Because we've got to read the whole passage if we want to really understand the full meaning. Notice how just 4 verses before Jesus mentions the winter and the Sabbath, he also instructs them to flee to the mountains of Judea. Okay, so let's just stop and think about this. If this whole passage pertains to us, does this mean that if persecution comes, I have to take a flight from where I live in the US, fly over to Israel, and take a drive from the airport to go hide in the mountains of Judea in order to escape religious persecution? So this verse very clearly demonstrates that in this passage, this entire section of Scripture, Jesus is referring to the Jewish saints at the end time of the tribulation. Again, Jesus is referring to a specific time, to a specific people in future events, and this is underscored by the simple fact that within this verse, there is no command or even instruction to keep the Sabbath. Well, Isaiah 66:23 shows that we're going to be keeping the Sabbath for eternity, since it says we'll be keeping the Sabbath in heaven and the new earth and the age to come. So since we'll be keeping the Sabbath for eternity, this proves that we have to keep it today. So this is describing the age to come through the eyes of the Old Covenant. And this was not uncommon for prophets to write this way, to describe things through the eyes of the Old Covenant that people could relate to. Let's get the full meaning of this verse by first backing up a couple verses to verses 20 through 21. And here you can see that it refers to the priests and the Levites. So, question: will the Levitical priesthood continue in the New Age? Definitely not. Hebrews clearly explains that the Levitical priesthood has been done away with. So we know that the prophet is not speaking literally here, but figuratively. Jumping back up to 23, if we're arguing that the Sabbath should be kept today because of this Old Testament prophetic description of the new earth, then we have to also argue that new moon celebrations should also be observed today, since they're also included in this verse. Let me repeat that again. If we're arguing that this verse teaches that the Sabbath must be observed today, then in order to maintain consistency with that argument, we would have to also argue that the new moon celebrations must also be observed today. In other words, it's not a logical method of interpretation to use only half of the information in a verse while ignoring the other half. The fact that the Sabbath and the new moon celebrations are mentioned together in the same verse only supports the fact that Old Covenant prophets described the new age to come using Old Covenant terminology, including ritual observances. In other words, it's not that new moons and Sabbaths will continue to be observed in heaven, since the Bible makes it clear those are done away with in the new covenant. Instead, this phrase is simply intended to express absolute, uninterrupted continuance of worship, and so it's just unmistakable that the prophet is using Old Testament terminology here. And this is, of course, something that the people at the time of his writing would be able to understand and relate to, and the prophet was simply using this terminology to explain that believers will be worshiping the Lord forever in heaven uninterrupted. And again, just as there is clearly no command here to continue to observe the new moons, there's no command here to continue to observe the Sabbath either. It was just Old Testament terminology used to describe the fact that believers are going to worship the Lord forever and ever, uninterrupted for all of eternity. And that wraps it up for today. If you like videos like these, you find them helpful, educational, please feel free to hit that notification bell, and don't forget to like and subscribe. Until next time, God bless.